The night my marriage cracked didn't happen during a screaming match or a dramatic confession. It happened quietly, on a Tuesday, while I was loading the dishwasher and my phone buzzed on the counter behind me. I remember that detail because I can still hear the clink of a plate against the rack when I turned around and saw her name on the screen. Not a missed call. A message. Short. Careful. The kind of message people send when they've rehearsed it in their head 100 times and still don't know how it's going to land. I'm Caleb, 34, and at that point I thought my life was settled in the boring, dependable way people are told to want. Married for 8 years. No kids yet. By choice. Or at least that's what I told people. Stable job in logistics. Mortgage. Weekend dinners with my wife's parents where her dad liked to lecture everyone about money while subtly reminding me that he once helped with our down payment. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd won. Inside, I'd been slowly shrinking for years without realizing it. My wife, Hannah, had always been confident to the point of arrogance. When we met in our mid-20s, I mistook that for strength. She walked into rooms like she owned them, spoke over people without apologizing, and laughed at her own jokes louder than anyone else. Her parents adored that about her, especially her mother, Linda, who treated Hannah like a flawless extension of herself. Linda had a habit of giving advice that was really just judgment wrapped in a smile, and if I didn't immediately agree, she'd look at Hannah and say things like, "Well, some people just aren't very adaptable." Early on, I learned my role in that family. I was the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who should compromise, because Hannah was spirited. If Hannah snapped at me, it was because she was passionate. If I pushed back, I was being sensitive. Her father, Mark, liked to pat me on the shoulder and say, "Happy wife, happy life, right?" As if it were wisdom instead of a warning. The message on my phone said, "Can we talk tonight?" Like really talk. Nothing else. No emoji. No explanation. I dried my hands, glanced down the hallway toward the bedroom, and felt that familiar tightening in my chest that had become background noise in my life. That feeling that something was off, but if I ignored it long enough, it would probably settle back into place. Dinner that night was quiet in a way that felt staged. Hannah picked at her food. I asked about her day. She gave short answers. When we finished eating, she didn't move toward the couch like usual. She stood at the table, arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere just over my shoulder. She said my name the way people do when they're about to say something that changes everything. Slowly, carefully, as if stretching it out might soften the impact. What followed didn't come out all at once. It never does. First, she told me she felt stuck. Then she said she hadn't felt seen in a long time. Then she said she'd been talking to someone who made her feel alive again. When I asked who, she hesitated just long enough for the answer to land before she said it. A coworker. Someone I'd heard about in passing. Someone whose jokes she'd quoted at dinner without mentioning his name. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She spoke like she was presenting a case, not confessing. She said it wasn't serious. That it just happened. That I shouldn't overreact. When I asked if she'd cheated, she sighed like I was being dense and said, "I don't like that word." I remember sitting down slowly, my legs suddenly unsteady, while she kept talking. She said she didn't want to end our marriage. She said she loved me, but love wasn't enough anymore. Then she said the sentence that still echoes in my head sometimes when I'm alone. Maybe we should open things up. You know, explore. Lots of couples do it. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the life we'd built. I asked her if this was something she'd thought about before cheating, or if it was just a convenient solution after. That was the first time she got angry. She accused me of making it about blame, of being controlling, of not understanding modern relationships. When I said I wasn't comfortable with an open marriage, her expression hardened into something colder. She told me I was being selfish, that I was holding her back. And then, casually, almost offhandedly, she said, "Honestly, Caleb, it's not like you'd find anyone better anyway. You should be grateful I'm even trying to make this work." That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not with a burst of rage. It was quieter than that, like a door closing. The days after were worse than the conversation itself. She acted like the discussion was settled, like I'd just need time to catch up to her decision. She started staying out later. She guarded her phone openly now, no longer pretending. When I tried to talk about boundaries, she rolled her eyes and told me I was being dramatic. Her parents, of course, found out. Hannah has never kept anything from her mother, especially when she wants backup. Linda called me the next morning and asked if we could clear the air. By that afternoon, I was sitting at their kitchen table, being lectured about compromise and growth and how Hannah had always been ahead of her time. Linda told me marriage was about sacrifice, and sometimes that meant letting go of outdated expectations. Mark chimed in to say that men my age should be careful not to throw away a good thing because of pride. No one asked how I felt. No one asked if I was okay. The assumption was clear. My job was to adapt. I went home that evening feeling smaller than I ever had. Hannah didn't even look up when I walked in. She just said, "My mom said you seemed defensive," like that was the real issue. That night, lying in bed next to her, listening to her breathe evenly while my mind raced, I realized this wasn't just about cheating or an open marriage. This was about years of being told, subtly and not so subtly, that I was replaceable, that my comfort mattered less than her desires, that I should be grateful for scraps of respect. And the worst part was this: for a long time, I believed them. A week later, something happened that pushed all of this from quiet despair into something sharper, something I couldn't ignore anymore. Hannah came home unusually cheerful, dropped her bag by the door, and said, almost brightly, "Oh, by the way, I invited someone to dinner tomorrow. I figured it's time you meet him." I didn't ask who she meant. I already knew. I didn't answer her right away. I just stood there, keys still in my hand, staring at her like she'd started speaking a language I didn't understand. She noticed my silence and finally looked up, annoyed rather than apologetic. "What?" she said. "I don't want this to be awkward forever. We're adults." I asked her if she was serious. She shrugged and said something that, at the time, felt surreal in how casually cruel it was. "If you're going to be part of my life, you're going to have to get used to this version of it." That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying old moments through a new lens. Every time she dismissed my concerns. Every time her parents had subtly reminded me I wasn't the one with leverage. I thought about how many times I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace, and how none of it had actually bought me any respect. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I reread emails without absorbing them. I checked my phone too often, half expecting another bomb to drop. Around noon, Linda texted me, "Dinner tonight will be good for everyone. Growth happens outside comfort zones." No question mark. No invitation. Just a statement. When I got home that evening, Hannah was already dressed up. Not overly so, but enough to send a message. She'd done her hair the way she used to for date nights. She noticed me noticing and smiled, clearly pleased. "He'll be here at 7, she said. "Try to be nice." I asked her why she was doing this. Really doing it. She sighed, as if I were exhausting her, and said, "Because I refuse to hide my happiness to protect your feelings." At exactly 7, the doorbell rang. Hannah practically skipped to the door. When she opened it, she laughed in a way I hadn't heard in months. Standing there was a man about my height, maybe a little taller, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to second-guess your place in a room. He stuck his hand out toward me before I could say anything. "Hey man, I'm Eric," he said, like we were meeting at a barbecue instead of my living room. I shook his hand because not doing so would have felt like surrendering something important. He complimented the house. Hannah lit up and told him how they'd made it their own. The word they hung in the air like a challenge. Dinner was a slow-motion humiliation. Hannah told stories about work that conveniently left me out of her life. Eric laughed too loudly, touching her arm in ways that were just subtle enough to be deniable. At one point, he joked about how old-school people overcomplicate relationships. Hannah glanced at me and smirked. When I excused myself to the kitchen, I heard them lower their voices. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but my name came up, and my feet stayed planted. "He'll come around," Hannah said. "He always does." Eric replied, "You sure? He looks like he's struggling." She laughed softly. "He needs me more than I need him." Something in my chest cracked then, not loudly, but deeply. When I came back to the table, I told them I wasn't feeling well and went to bed. Hannah didn't follow. She stayed up with him. I heard laughter through the wall long after the dishes should have been done. The next few weeks were a masterclass in how to erase someone while still sharing a home. Hannah stopped pretending this was a phase. She openly scheduled her time. Some nights, she didn't come home. Other nights, she did, smelling like unfamiliar cologne, acting like I was an inconvenient roommate. Her parents doubled down. Linda invited me over for coffee and told me, with genuine concern in her voice, that I should consider therapy to work through my jealousy. Mark suggested I focus on my career instead of micromanaging Hannah's personal growth. Every conversation ended with some variation of "this is just how the world works now." What hurt most wasn't just Hannah's behavior. It was how quickly the narrative shifted. Somehow, I was now the obstacle, the one refusing to evolve, the one creating tension. Hannah started using phrases like unsafe energy and emotional labor, weaponizing language she'd picked up online to justify everything she was doing. Then came the money. One evening, Hannah mentioned offhandedly that she'd moved some funds around. I asked what she meant. She said she'd opened a separate account for independence. When I asked how much she'd transferred, she told me not to worry about it. "It's not like you were doing anything with it." That night, I logged into our joint account. Or tried to. The password didn't work. I reset it and felt my stomach drop as the numbers loaded. A significant portion of our savings was gone. Not a mistake. Not a small amount. Enough to notice. Enough to matter. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She told me she was protecting herself, that she didn't know how things would turn out, and she needed to be smart. When I asked why she hadn't talked to me first, she rolled her eyes and said, "This is exactly why." I called Linda, hoping, stupidly, that she'd see reason. She told me Hannah had every right to secure her future. That as a husband, I should support that. When I mentioned the joint nature of the account, Linda's tone sharpened. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you started resisting change." It was around this time that Eric started coming over even when Hannah wasn't home. He'd sit on the couch like he belonged there, scrolling on his phone, barely acknowledging me. Once, he asked if I could move my car so he could park in the driveway. He said it politely. Hannah backed him up without hesitation. The breaking point didn't come in a single explosive moment. It built, layer by layer, until the weight of it became unbearable. It came the day I received an email from a lawyer I didn't recognize, informing me that Hannah had initiated a post-nuptial agreement review. Not a discussion, not a conversation. Paperwork, strategy, preparation. That night, I waited until she came home. I asked her, calmly, if she was planning to leave me. She paused, considering, then said, "I don't know. But I'm not going to let you hold me hostage while I figure it out." I asked her if she'd already decided what would happen to the house. She smiled, the same confident smile she wore into every room, and said, "My parents helped us get it. You really think they'd let me lose it?" That's when I realized this wasn't just betrayal. It was coordination. I went to bed early, my head pounding, my thoughts spiraling. Somewhere in the middle of the night, my phone buzzed. A notification from my bank. Another transfer. Larger this time. As I stared at the screen, heart racing, a second notification came through. A message from an unknown number. "Hey Caleb, this is Eric. We should probably talk. There's something Hannah hasn't told you yet." I sat up in the dark, the room suddenly feeling too small, my phone glowing like a warning I couldn't ignore, knowing whatever was coming next was going to change everything. I didn't reply to Eric that night. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly, and I knew anything I typed in that moment would either give him power or give Hannah exactly what she wanted, proof that I was unraveling. Instead, I lay there staring at the ceiling while Hannah slept beside me, completely at ease, as if she hadn't just drained our account and handed control of my life to someone else. By morning, I felt hollow. Not angry. Not even sad in a way I could cry about. Just empty. I went to work out of habit, drove on autopilot, nodded at people when they spoke to me. Around noon, my manager pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. Apparently, I'd missed a deadline. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that. I almost laughed, because of course this was bleeding into everything now. That afternoon, Eric texted again. This time it was longer. He said Hannah had been meaning to tell me, but things got complicated. He said she'd told him our marriage was basically over months ago. He said he didn't want drama, just transparency. Then he added, "Also, she's pregnant. And yeah, it's mine." I read that message so many times it stopped looking like words. My first thought wasn't anger. It was relief, which scared me more than anything else. Relief that the confusion finally had a shape. Relief that I wasn't imagining the distance, the contempt, the planning. Relief that I could finally stop wondering what was wrong with me. When I confronted Hannah that evening, she didn't deny it. She didn't even look ashamed. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, expression calm. and said she hadn't told me because she didn't want to stress me out. She said it was early, that things could still be handled maturely. She said she hoped I'd understand that this wasn't about hurting me, but about her choosing happiness. I asked her if she ever planned to tell me. She said she assumed Eric would eventually bring it up, like it was a scheduling issue, not a life-altering betrayal. That night was the lowest point of my life. Not because she cheated, not even because she was pregnant. It was the realization that the person I'd built my adult life around didn't see me as a human being with agency. I was an obstacle, a logistical problem to manage until I stopped being inconvenient. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch until morning, replaying every compromise I'd ever made, every time I'd chosen peace over dignity. Somewhere around sunrise, something hardened inside me. Not rage. Resolve. The next few weeks were brutal. Hannah moved into the guest room, though she spent most nights elsewhere. Her parents stopped pretending to be neutral. Linda called to inform me that they'd spoken to a lawyer and expected me to be reasonable about next steps. Mark suggested I stay quiet to protect my reputation. Hannah started referring to the house as hers in conversation. She told mutual friends I was having a hard time adjusting. I stopped correcting the narrative. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped asking for fairness from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. Instead, I did something I should have done years earlier. I made an appointment with my own lawyer. Walking into that office felt like admitting failure. I remember sitting there, hands clasped too tightly, explaining everything in a flat voice like I was talking about someone else's life. The lawyer listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "You're not powerless here. You've just been acting like you are." That sentence followed me home. The truth was, Hannah hadn't been as careful as she thought. Some of the money she moved wasn't just joint savings. It was tied to accounts I'd opened before the marriage. Accounts her parents didn't know about. Accounts she didn't bother to fully understand because she assumed I was clueless about finances. The lawyer explained my options calmly, methodically, like this was a chess game and not my marriage dissolving in slow motion. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I focused on myself in small, unglamorous ways. I moved my important documents into a safe deposit box. I changed passwords she didn't know existed. I started running again in the mornings, not to get fit, but to burn off the constant buzz of adrenaline under my skin. I stopped answering Linda's calls. I stopped responding to Mark's texts. When Hannah tried to bait me into arguments, I kept my answers short and neutral. She hated that. The less I reacted, the more she pushed. She accused me of being cold, of being passive-aggressive. She told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. Once, she said, "You're acting like you're planning something." Half joking, half suspicious. I smiled and said I was just tired. Meanwhile, my life started expanding in quiet, unexpected ways. Work noticed my renewed focus once the shock settled. A project I'd been sidelined on suddenly became mine. My manager put me forward for a role that involved more responsibility, more visibility. I said yes without hesitation. I reconnected with people I'd drifted away from over the years. Old friends who didn't ask for explanations, just listened. One of them said something that stuck with me. "You look lighter. Like you finally stopped carrying someone else's expectations." Hannah noticed the changes too. She started watching me more closely, asking questions she'd never asked before. Where I was going, who I was seeing. When I told her I had plans, she frowned like I'd broken an unspoken rule. Eric, on the other hand, grew bolder. He started treating the house like his future home. He brought up renovations, nursery ideas. Once, he referred to me as the situation in front of Hannah, like I wasn't even in the room. Hannah laughed, then glanced at me to see if I'd react. I didn't. The real shift came the day I received confirmation that a transfer Hannah had made weeks earlier had been reversed. Perfectly legal. Perfectly documented. She stormed into the house that evening, face flushed, phone in hand, demanding to know what I'd done. I looked at her calmly and said, "I protected myself, just like you did." She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. For the first time, there was uncertainty in her eyes. Fear, maybe. Or the realization that the version of me she'd dismissed for years was no longer playing the role she'd assigned. She left that night in tears. Called her mother. Called Eric. By morning, Linda was texting me again, this time with a softer tone, talking about mediation and fairness in family. I didn't reply, because by then, I wasn't rebuilding out of desperation anymore. I was rebuilding with intention. And I knew, deep down, that Hannah and her family had no idea how much ground they were about to lose. A week later, something landed in my inbox that confirmed it. A document Hannah assumed I'd never see. Something she and her parents had been counting on quietly. I read it once, then twice. Then I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, and realized the balance of power had just shifted completely. And this time, they had no idea what was coming next. I didn't confront her about the document. Not immediately. That was the old version of me, the one who believed clarity came from confrontation. The new version understood something far more important. Leverage only works if the other side doesn't know you have it. The document was an internal email chain. Not meant for me. Not even meant to leave a small circle of people who thought they were being careful. It outlined a plan Hannah, her parents, and their lawyer had been quietly discussing for months. Not weeks. Months. Long before she ever suggested an open marriage. Long before Eric's name slipped into our conversations. The plan was simple in concept and ruthless in execution. Stall me emotionally. Normalize the cheating. Frame me as unstable and resistant to growth. Drain shared assets under the guise of independence. Then, once I was sufficiently isolated and exhausted, push for a separation that positioned Hannah as the reasonable party protecting herself from an unpredictable husband. There were notes about timing, about optics, about how to encourage me to move out voluntarily so the house remained undisputed. Linda had written one line that made my stomach turn. Caleb prefers peace. He won't fight if we don't corner him. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the house suddenly feeling like a set instead of a home. Every memory replayed itself differently now. The dinners, the lectures, the way Linda always spoke for Hannah. This wasn't impulsive. This was choreography, and I was done dancing. I printed the email chain and handed it to my lawyer the next morning. He read it slowly, once, then again. When he looked up, his expression wasn't sympathetic. It was impressed. They overplayed their hand, he said, and they underestimated you. From that moment on, everything became deliberate. We didn't rush. That was the key. My lawyer explained that people like Hannah and her parents thrived on momentum, on forcing reactions, on pushing situations to a breaking point where the loudest voices won. So we did the opposite. We slowed everything down. I stayed in the house. I didn't argue about it. I didn't threaten. I simply existed there, calmly, methodically, documenting everything. Dates, times, conversations, financial movements. Every instance of Eric being there overnight. Every message from Linda trying to soften the situation now that the money wasn't flowing one way anymore. Hannah oscillated between panic and contempt. One day she'd accuse me of sabotaging her future. The next, she'd ask if we could reset the tone and talk like adults. I gave her nothing. Polite responses. Neutral expressions. No emotional supply. It drove her crazy. Eric didn't help matters. Once he realized I wasn't leaving, his confidence turned brittle. He started pushing Hannah harder, pressing for timelines, asking when I'd be out of the picture. I could hear their arguments through the walls sometimes, his voice tight with frustration, hers sharp and defensive. One evening, I overheard something that confirmed everything. Eric said, "You told me he wouldn't fight, that he'd just fold." Hannah snapped back, "He will. He always does." I smiled to myself in the dark. Quietly, I started building a support system Hannah never thought I'd have. Not mutual friends who'd already picked sides, but people who knew me before I'd learned how to disappear inside a relationship. Old colleagues, mentors, even a former supervisor who'd once told me I had leadership potential I never seemed interested in using. Opportunities started lining up. A role at work that would require relocation in the future. Nothing immediate, just an option. A door I could open when the time was right. Financially, we got precise. My lawyer filed motions Hannah didn't expect, based on the improper transfers and the documented intent to manipulate shared assets. We didn't accuse. We presented facts. Cleanly. Professionally. Every move backed by evidence. Linda called me after she received notice. Her tone was completely different now. No lectures. No condescension. Just concern. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "We all want what's best for everyone." I told her, calmly, that misunderstandings tend to happen when people make assumptions. She didn't like that answer. Mark tried next. He asked if we could talk man to man. I agreed, but only in public, at a cafe near his office. He arrived with the posture of someone used to being in control and left looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply told him I knew what they'd planned and that I was no longer interested in sacrificing myself for their convenience. He warned me not to burn bridges. I told him bridges only matter if you ever plan on going back. The real setup, though, wasn't legal or financial. It was psychological. Hannah had always relied on the belief that she was the prize, that no matter what she did, I'd be the one afraid to lose. So I let her believe that for just a little while longer. I stayed calm. I stayed predictable. I didn't flaunt my progress. I didn't threaten her security. Then, slowly, I started removing myself from her orbit in ways she couldn't control. I stopped asking where she was going. I stopped checking if she'd eaten. I stopped filling silence. When she complained about Eric, I nodded and said, "That sounds stressful," without offering solutions. When she asked what I thought about the baby, I said, "That's your situation to manage." That phrase hit her harder than any argument ever had. The house dynamic shifted. For the first time, Hannah felt alone while still being watched. She couldn't tell if I was planning something or simply done caring, and not knowing terrified her. Then came the opportunity. Hannah's parents were hosting a family gathering. Not a holiday, not a celebration, just one of those forced-together events Linda liked to use to reassert control and manage narratives. Hannah told me about it casually, assuming I wouldn't come. "I think it'd be best if you skipped this one," she said. Given everything. I told her I'd think about it. That night, my lawyer called. He said the timing was perfect, that the next move, if executed properly, would put everything on record in a way Hannah and her parents couldn't spin, that it would force them to respond publicly instead of behind closed doors. I looked around the house I'd once been willing to lose just to keep the peace. I thought about the man I'd been when this all started. The man who believed endurance was the same thing as love. And I decided I would attend that gathering. Not to confront, not to explode, but to let the truth surface exactly where they'd least expect it. Because the most effective revenge isn't loud. It's inevitable. And they were walking straight toward it without realizing I'd already set the path. The gathering was exactly what I expected it to be. Linda's house was spotless in that aggressively curated way, like no real life was allowed to leave fingerprints. The table was set as if for a magazine spread. The guest list was carefully chosen. Family, a few close friends, people who already believed Hannah's version of events. Eric was there too, seated a little too comfortably, one hand resting on Hannah's lower back like a territorial marker. When I walked in, the room shifted. Conversations dipped. Smiles froze, and then reset into something polite but brittle. Linda's eyes flicked to Hannah immediately, irritation flashing across her face before she plastered on a welcoming smile. "Caleb," she said, drawing my name out. "You decided to come." "I did," I replied evenly. "I thought it was time." Hannah looked like she'd swallowed something sour. Eric stiffened. Mark cleared his throat and gestured for everyone to sit. Linda launched into her usual routine. Small talk, praise for Hannah's strength, subtle references to how hard this period had been for their family. I watched quietly, letting the performance run its course. Halfway through dinner, Linda turned to me and said, "Caleb, I hope you understand how difficult all of this has been for Hannah. She's carrying so much stress right now. We're all just trying to move forward in a healthy way." That was my cue. "I agree," I said. "Transparency is healthy." The room went quiet. I stood up slowly, reached into my jacket, and placed a folder on the table. No theatrics. No raised voice. Just paper, neatly arranged. "I received some documents recently," I continued. "They outline a plan that was put in motion long before Hannah ever told me she was unhappy. A plan to isolate me, drain shared assets, and pressure me into leaving my own home under the assumption that I wouldn't fight back." Linda's face drained of color. Eric shifted in his seat. Hannah stared at the folder like it might bite her. "I didn't bring this to start a scene," I said calmly. "I brought it because I'm done letting other people control the narrative about my life." Mark spoke first, voice tight. "Caleb, this isn't the place for." "It's exactly the place," I interrupted gently. "You planned this in private. You counted on silence. You counted on me being embarrassed enough to disappear." I opened the folder and slid copies of the email chain across the table. Dates. Names. Linda's words in black and white. Mark didn't touch his copy. He didn't need to. He already knew. Hannah stood abruptly. "This is insane. You're twisting things." I'm not, I replied. I'm documenting them. Eric finally spoke, his confidence gone. You said this was handled, he said to Hannah. You told me he wouldn't do this. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and said, she told everyone exactly what they wanted to hear. The fallout was immediate. Linda tried to pivot, insisting the emails were taken out of context. Mark demanded we stop and talk privately. Hannah accused me of humiliating her on purpose. I listened to it all without reacting. Then I delivered the part that actually mattered. I've already filed the appropriate motions, I said. The improper transfers have been reversed. The post-nuptial review has been formally contested. The house is no longer assumed to be yours, Hannah, and from this point forward, all communication goes through attorneys. Silence. Not stunned silence. Not dramatic silence. The kind of silence where people realize a door has closed and they were standing on the wrong side of it. I gathered my folder and added one final sentence. You thought I wouldn't fight because I value peace. What you never understood is that peace isn't free. I was just tired of paying for it alone. I left without waiting for a response. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. The chaos didn't explode, it collapsed inward. Linda stopped calling entirely. Mark sent one brief message about resolving things reasonably. I didn't reply. Eric moved out of Hannah's life faster than he'd entered it. Apparently, the confidence that comes from stealing someone else's stability doesn't last long when consequences show up. Hannah tried everything. Anger, tears, nostalgia, late-night messages about memories we used to share. She told me she'd made a mistake, that she'd been confused, that she missed the way I used to look at her. She blamed stress. Her parents, Eric, everyone but herself. When none of that worked, she tried fear. She warned me I'd end up alone, that starting over at my age wasn't easy, that no one would ever understand me the way she did. That was when I realized how small her world really was. The legal process played out exactly as my lawyer predicted. Methodical, unemotional, fair. The house was sold. Assets were divided properly. The narrative she'd worked so hard to construct unraveled under scrutiny. Quietly, public records have a way of telling the truth without raising their voice. I took the new role at work. Different city, different routine, same values. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, without rushing to fill the space she'd left. I learned how to enjoy silence again, how to trust my own instincts, how to exist without apologizing for it. Months later, Hannah reached out one last time. She said she was sorry. She said she'd lost everything that mattered. She asked if it was too late. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I was tempted, but because I was grateful. Grateful that I could finally answer honestly. I typed one word. No. And for the first time in years, it felt like the truth belonged to me.